All right. Well, welcome to our district new teachers. My name is Josh Meggs, and I will be taking you through the basics of our new teacher mentoring program that you're going to be working through throughout the course of this school year. So, our learning outcomes by the end of today's session, new teachers and new teacher mentors will be able to understand the rationale behind the year-long mentoring program, be familiar with the proposed calendar, and begin to schedule future meetings. And finally, know how to use the progress rubric to track ongoing progress and growth. So the book that we are going to be using is The Highly Effective Teacher, 7 Classroom Tested Practices that Foster Student Success by Jeff C. Marshall. The book is going to be provided to both mentees and mentors by the school district so that you both have access to a copy. The topics that we will be covering are in a slightly different order than are presented in the textbook. That is so that we can make sure that what our district feels is most important is covered first and continuing to build on that through later tips. So tip number 3 is what we'll start with, which is a safe, respectful, well-organized learning environment. Tip number 1 will be second, which is a coherent, connected learning progression. Tip number 6 is a creative problem-solving culture. Tip number 4 is a challenging, rigorous learning experience. Tip number 5 is an interactive, thoughtful learning. Tip 7 is monitoring, assessment, and feedback that guide and inform instruction and learning. And finally, tip 2 is strategies, resources, and technologies that enhance learning. So to give you a little bit more information on each of those tips, let's start with tip number 3. So tip number 3 is a safe, respectful, well-organized learning environment. Our district believes that students learn best in a learning environment which is safe, respectful, and well organized. And to give you an example of what our text has to offer regarding this, Marshall states that all students, but particularly many with special needs, perform better when they have norms and routines to guide them. Our second tip that we will be discussing is tip number 1, which is coherent, connective learning progression. Our district believes that students must be able to see a need for what they are learning and must have ways to know when they have met their learning goals. Marshall in the text states that constructing a coherent and well-aligned instructional plan requires connecting learning in several ways to prevent it from being isolated and meaningless to students. The third tip will be tip number 6, which is a creative problem-solving culture. Our district once again believes that students are more engaged in learning when they are required to come up with unique and creative solutions to real-world or relevant problems. And in the text, Marshall states this as, we can do many things, but a critical starting point is to approach teaching and learning like a puzzle or a mystery to be solved rather than facts to be memorized and restated on a quiz or a test. The next tip is tip 4, which is a challenging, rigorous learning experience. Our district believes that students must be challenged at appropriate levels. Too much challenge and students shut down before starting. Too little challenge and students don't see the value in their work. From the text, Marshall states that students must see the value of what you ask of them before you can expect them to develop the habit of self-control. Tip 5 will be our 5th tip, which is interactive, thoughtful learning. Our district believes that the classroom culture of low stakes, high rewards encourages students to try their best without the risk of failure. In the text, Marshall states that in reality, performance in and out of the classroom is best when the challenge is high, but the pressure is low. Our second to last tip is tip 7, which is monitoring, assessment, and feedback that guide and inform instruction and learning. The rationale behind this tip is that consistent, timely feedback is as valuable to teachers as it is to students. In the text, Marshall states that in addition, feedback needs to promote self-regulation or metacognition in order to help students understand what they know, what they don't know, and how they need to progress from their current abilities. And our final tip that we will be looking at in this program is tip 2, which is strategies, resources, and technologies that enhance learning. Our district believes that when students are provided with opportunities to work collaboratively on programs or problems and projects which interest them or are relevant to them, they'll be much more engaged and successful in the learning process. In the text, Marshall says that if we want learning to be student or learner focused, then we as teachers need to find opportunities to have students talk, collaborate, and create, not to provide flashier sit and get presentations. So obviously, as you can see, lot of different things that we'll be covering. So to help you managing this task that's been set before you, here is a timeline for you and your mentor to begin to look at. Now, I do want to mention that this timeline is approximate. It's not as if you have to follow this exactly. You'll notice that the time frame only goes through 30 weeks, whereas our school year is 36. That's to account for school holidays, breaks, to give you some time at the end of each 9 weeks to get caught up with grading, and also just any other unforeseen circumstances for you to be able to move things around as needed. The one thing that we ask is that you follow the tips in the order that we've set them out for you. So after this August pre-service meeting, to begin weeks 1 and 2 by reading through tip 3 and then meeting with your mentor to discuss. And then for weeks 3 and 4 to begin to implement some of the strategies that you've gained from tip 3. And then at the conclusion of that, to complete the progress rubric along with your mentor. Then in weeks 5 and 6, we continue with that process with tip 1, again, reading through that first and then meeting with your mentor. And then in the following weeks to implement some of the strategies from tip 1 and to once again complete that progress rubric with your mentor. Now, again, I'm not going to read through all of those, but you can see that it is a very similar process on a week-to-week basis. However, how you organize that with your mentor is up to you. At the conclusion of our session here, you'll have a little bit of time with your mentor to be able to start to maybe schedule out some dates where you and your mentor can meet to either discuss what you've learned from the reading, to begin to talk about how to implement it, or to complete those progress rubrics so that you guys can have a time set up for each of those to take place. Now, that progress rubric that we've been mentioning, here is what that looks like. Along with each of the tips, there are some essential questions which have been taken from the textbook that you'll be using. In addition to that, it will give you a chance to state whether you have not yet observed those tips in your own classroom, whether you feel as though you are developing those different strategies, or whether you have already mastered those. You're going to be completing this at a couple of different times. You're going to be completing it as you work through each of the tips along with your mentor. You're then going to complete it an additional time at the conclusion of this program so that you can see how you've progressed from as you were learning to where you are at the end. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for any questions. I appreciate your time today and taking some time out of your very busy start of the school year to go over the mentoring program along with me. I would appreciate for you to fill in this survey once you have completed the program so that we can make improvements for this next year to continue to improve. I want you to know your feedback is valued.